We now start Chapter 8, Part 2, the movie chapter. Single-screen movie theaters are a wonderful thing. They're a lot of fun to go to. This particular single-screen theater, the Vista, is where Hollywood, Sunset, Hillhurst, and Virgil all come together in one big complicated intersection. And the only way that I could describe this movie theater, if you've never been to it, is the inside looks like what the inside of Hogwarts movie theater would look like if they had one. Well, I guess what I'm trying to say is going to one of these really cool old single-screen movie theaters is a very nice audience experience. Now that said, don't expect any more of them to be built. And the reason for that is they're just not a very good business proposition. You'd say, yeah, but what about small towns where there are fewer people? Well, even there, multiplex theaters dominate. So if you are listening to this and you have chat available to you, I would be interested in hearing your theories as to why the single-screen movie theater is a dwindling, aging, dying species. If single-screen indoor theaters are a dwindling, aging, perhaps dying species, then drive-in theaters are pretty much extinct, especially in our part of the world. Let me just give you a little story about a local drive-in theater that I don't think any of you are old enough to remember. Until about 25 years ago, there was a place called the Pickwick Drive-In in Burbank, and it was behind the bowling alley and the ice skating rink, and you got to it off of Alameda. You may wonder, well, what's on that land today? Well, there's a Vaughn's Pavilion supermarket, there's an El Pollo Loco, there's an office supply store, and a bunch of other stuff. So, if you've got the chat box up while going through this chapter, try contacting me. Tell me why you think that drive-in theaters, even though they sound like a cool idea, they just don't seem to pencil out in modern day Southern California. Movie exhibition doesn't just mean going out somewhere. Movie exhibition can also mean digital home media. So streaming services are now the biggest source of revenue for the movies. Well, let me just say that again. It is the biggest source. Theaters are still big, but they're now number 2. As for such things as DVDs, they are now running a distant third. Now, let's get to the making of a movie. I'm going to talk about 3 major people on the set as a movie is being made. First, let's start with the director. You know, normally we think of the director as a great creative force. Years ago, we would have thought about Alfred Hitchcock as the master of suspense, or in more recent years, we would think about someone like Spike Lee and his social commentary. And I do agree, a director puts his or her creative imprint on a film. But what you maybe don't realize is that a director is also in charge of getting the budget up on the screen, as they like to say in Hollywood. A director who consistently goes over shooting schedule and blows past the budget is not going to be making movies for very long. The cinematographer is in charge of the photographing of the movie. And you know, usually good cinematography is like good refereeing or good umpiring. It kind of goes into the background. You don't notice it. It's just sort of competent. But every once in a while, a cinematographer will do something different and it'll really work. Think about something like The Artist, which won Best Picture some years ago. It was meant to be a 21st century silent movie. And so first, it was obvious you would want to shoot that in black and white because there were no color silent films. But beyond that, the cinematographer also looked at the actual top silent films of the 1920s to see how were they shot. What were the camera angles like? How were they framed? And so the result was cinematography that created a modern silent movie. The film editor, I believe, has a very pressure-packed job. Just imagine by the time that massive amount of footage gets to the film editor, the film has probably already been promised for a Thanksgiving weekend release or a Christmas week release or what have you. And so with the clock running in consultation with the director, the film editor edits the scenes. How long should each scene go? Studios don't like long movies because theater owners don't like long movies. So the scenes are edited and put in order. The camera angles are selected. Close-ups, when and for how long. All of this is done by the film editor. When we think about the making of a film, we think about the glamour jobs. We think about stars and directors and maybe high-powered screenwriters. But I don't think we think very much about the movie people who live in the communities where we live. There have been a lot of mortgages that have been paid for in Glendale and Burbank and the Atwater and Eagle Rock neighborhoods of Los Angeles by the blue-collar people who work on films. That electrician who brings electricity to a set. A crane operator who does the overhead shots, and so on and so forth. Now, these are typically good jobs if you can find them. A painter who is working on creating sets for the movies usually makes more money than if you were just painting somebody's houses. Now, this fine lifestyle is to some degree going away. Runaway production. Let me tell you what it isn't, and then I'll tell you what it is. Runaway production isn't filming far away because it's a creative decision. For example, many years ago when Francis Ford Coppola shot his Vietnam War epic Apocalypse Now in the Cambodian jungle, that was a creative decision. Nothing looks more like the Southeast Asian jungle than the Southeast Asian jungle. Runaway production, however, is when primary shooting goes to Vancouver, Canada, or goes to a lower cost portion of the United States like Louisiana, simply to save a few bucks. That's runaway production. And if production is moving to Vancouver and you're the cinematographer, well, obviously you're going. They can't shoot the film without you. But if you're the crane operator for overhead shots, no, they'll replace you with someone local. Let's talk about movies shooting on location. Anytime a movie is shot on location, it is someplace other than the studio lot. Now, on the studio lot, you may have indoor scenes shot on sound stages. You may also have outdoor scenes that are shot at, outdoor locations like Universal's Main Street set. But when something is truly shot on, it is not on the studio lot. And sometimes those locations can be halfway across the world. The old John Wayne Maureen O'Hara movie, The Quiet Man. I'm thinking about it because it was an Irish tale, and it always gets shown on TV around St. Patrick's Day. Well, that was shot in a small town in Ireland for authenticity's sake. So, that's sometimes what on location means. You are going halfway across the world to get a certain look. On location can also mean someplace right here in town. And I think it's part of being an Angelino to be able to look at a movie or a TV show or an ad and say, oh, that's the Orpheum Theater, or oh, that's the steps of LA City Hall, or that's the Griffith Observatory. Well, if you're following this lecture and you have the chat box open, I'd be curious when was the last time that you saw a scene from something and you recognized it as someplace local? Movies are going through their own atoms to bits transition. They are becoming less physical and more digital. I mean, think about how much more CGI is used now. I mean, it is very typical for movies to be part live action and part computer generated to the degree that it can become hard to know where the CGI ends and the live actors begin. Furthermore, movies are going through an atoms to bits transition in that the physical medium of film is being phased out. For many years, cinematographers and directors kind of resisted digital movie cameras. They were afraid that the technology be unreliable. But now, digital movie cameras are the standard. That also has an impact on the editing of film. I had an uncle who was a film cutter, which was a title for a lower level film editor. He worked at Paramount during the studio years. And he worked with a moviola. And that was where you took the physical medium of film and you ran it through this little hand-cranked machine where the film cutter could look through an eyepiece and see each frame individually so that he would know where to cut it. Well, today, a film editor is essentially a computer operator because all of that editing is done digitally. Furthermore, when movies are shown, they are no longer, in most cases, sent out on those huge canisters of film. It is typical now for a multiplex, if it has any film projectors at all, to maybe have one room that has a film projector. All the rest of it is digital projection. And you know what? For us, the audience, that is actually a good thing. And it's a good thing because film gets beat up. It gets scratched and nicked every time it goes through a projector. So if we're seeing that print, that film print, the 200th time that it's been shown, it's not going to look as good as it looked on opening night. You don't have that problem if the movie is a digital file. Bollywood is the nickname that has been given for the film industry in India. And I think those of us who live in this part of the world, we just need to accept that Hollywood is not the biggest maker of film. Bollywood is. Furthermore, the Indian film industry is not just about making a lot of films. They are also a creative center. I mean, think about the musical, which was a staple of Hollywood movies from the 1930s to the 1960s. The Indian film industry has revived those big singing and dancing type films. And furthermore, not only are they able to make it work in their films, it is having an influence on American films. I mean, think about something like La La Land. If you recall, if you've seen La La Land, it has that scene on the freeway where people are singing and dancing on the roofs of their cars. oh, that was very much inspired by Bollywood. I think further evidence that the Indian film industry not just makes a lot of films, they make really good films, is when Slumdog Millionaire won the 2009 Oscar for Best Picture. Not the best Indian picture, the best picture anywhere. Movie content has been regulated for a long time, about 90 years. In the 1920s, American films were getting a little bit more daring in their content. They were getting a little more sexual. They were getting a little more violent. And sometimes criminals were portrayed as living a glamorous lifestyle. This concerned religious people, parents, and others. And by the late 1920s, the Motion Picture Producers of America, the organization that represents the biggest movie studios and also the large movie theater chains, they realized that they ran the risk of having Congress censor the movies. Now, that was only their second worst fear. Their very worst fear was that Congress would not censor the movies, but that states or maybe even cities would. I mean, think about what a nightmare that would have been for the movie makers. And so what they decided to do was to hire, or maybe it's more appropriate to say they cast for the part, a gentleman named Will Hays to be the moral authority over the movies. Hays was a former Postmaster General of the United States and an elder of the Presbyterian Church. He made the perfect moral czar for the movies. Will Hays' first job was to gather together a committee of leading citizens. And together, that committee created a set of rules for clean movies. It was called the Hays Code. And all the major studios and all the major theater chains were on board with the Hays Code. I mean, after all, it was their organization that set all of this into motion. Under the Hays Code, there were tight limits on how much sexuality could be depicted in a movie. Profanity, remember, we are now in the early years of talking pictures, so profanity was very much prohibited. And with violence, it wasn't just what level of violence could and could not be shown. It was also the idea that crime does not pay. There was a great concern in those days that it would be detrimental to the moral upbringing of children if gangsters were shown as living a glamorous lifestyle and getting away with their crimes. The Hays Code was very powerful, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. You could make a movie that violated the Hays Code. You would just have a hard time showing it in movie theaters. Because, like I say, all the big movie theater chains, they were on board with the Hays Code. Things began to break down by the 1960s. And what was happening by the 60s was that it became clear to the studio and theater owners that teenagers and young adults were the new main customers of the movie business. And frankly, those young people, those teenagers and young adults, they wanted sexuality in their films. They wanted rough language and violence. And so there were a couple of attempts to liberalize the Hays Code in the mid-1960s, but they just didn't work. It turned out that the whole pass-fail system had to be changed. And so the bare bones of the rating system that you know of today began in 1968. And it began with only 4 ratings: G, PG, R, and X. Now, the G rating was originally thought to be what most movie makers would go for most of the time. Well, the flaw in that logic is that, as you know, today when you think of a G-rated film, you think of a film for just little kids. The X rating was originally meant for legitimate filmmaking that pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable in American films. For example, one early film that was originally made for an X rating was Midnight Cowboy. And it was the story of a young man who moved to the big city, to New York, and he fell into the world of male prostitution. Well, that's certainly something you couldn't tell under the Hays Code, a story you couldn't tell. Well, what happened to Midnight Cowboy, which was eventually recut to an R, and other films like it, is that the major studios found they couldn't make an X-rated film that could make money, largely because they couldn't effectively advertise it. Television and radio were terrified of advertising X-rated films, even trailers for X-rated films, because they felt it would violate the Federal Communication Commission's decency standards. Major newspapers, like the LA Times, felt that running ads for X-rated movies would offend the audience. So very soon, an R became the practical limit for major Hollywood films, and the X rating was abandoned to the hardcore pornographers. In the mid-1980s, after the first Indiana Jones film, Raiders of the Lost Ark, the PG-13 rating was added. Parents requested some sort of a midpoint between PG and R. Some years later, the NC-17, no children under 17 under any circumstances, rating was implemented. Now, with the NC-17 rating, there were several films early on that sought that rating, but not many have tried for it since. Well, if you're on the chat box, what do you think about all this? You know, Hollywood says that the rating system doesn't really regulate the film. It just regulates the audience that gets to see the film. Well, I don't know. What do you think? Does it constitute censorship? Movies and diversity. Well, if you look at American movies from the perspective of who gets nominated for an Oscar, oh my gosh, that's not a very diverse group of folks. That has led to the hashtag campaign, Oscars So White. And why is this so? Well, apparently it's because of the people who vote on who gets to be nominated for an Academy Award and who wins. The Motion Picture Academy of Arts and Sciences. There is a belief that that organization is really struggling for diversity. Note this Los Angeles Times study. I know it's not brand new, but that said, 2012 isn't that long ago. The Academy voting members are 94% white. I remember remarking to a class, my gosh, that's more white than Beverly Hills. And then I looked it up to make sure I was right. And yeah, Beverly Hills is only 88% white. So the Motion Picture Academy, as of 2012, was 94% white and 77% male. Those are not figures that foster diversity. The movie industry has also been criticized for what's called whitewashing. And whitewashing is a story that clearly calls for a character of color, but then when the movie is made, a white actor gets the part. An example would be a few years ago, my son showed me the series of stories in Death Note, and I found it just a fascinating story. And then a couple of years ago, when, who was it? Was it Netflix? They made something out of Death Note. The main character was not Japanese or even Asian. That's whitewashing. the Bechdel Test. The Bechdel Test was devised by film critic Alison Bechdel. And it's a very simple test that tries to get at the idea, do female characters have a meaningful presence in a movie? And it's an easy test to apply. Question number one. There are 3 questions in the Bechdel test. Question number 1. Are there 2 or more female characters in the movie who are simply major enough to have names? 2. Do these 2 or more female characters who have names, do they get to talk to each other, as opposed to talking to a man? Do the 2 or more female characters who have names, do they at some point in the film get to talk to each other? And then the third question, when they do get to talk to each other, do they get to talk to each other about something other than a man? You would be surprised how many movies do not pass the Bechdel test. Now, if you are on the chat box, I think it would be a fun topic to get your opinion of what you think of the Bechdel test. On the next slide, I'm going to show you what the pass rate is, what the fail rate is for the Bechdel test. Well, a lot of films fail the Bechdel test. I guess that on this graphic, which only goes up to 2013, that maybe the only time period where even half of films may have passed the Bechdel test is between 2000 and 2004. When you look at why films fail the Bechdel test, it's pretty consistent over all the time periods that the female characters don't get to talk to each other. Apparently, they're just talking to male characters. Third, movies make money in ways other than streaming services, release in theaters, and physical media like DVDs. Ancillary or secondary markets for films, in some cases, can be the biggest moneymaker, especially if it's an action franchise that has considerable appeal to children. I have this Star Wars Lego model up here because there's an old story about George Lucas when he was trying to sell the first Star Wars movies, what today we would recognize as episodes 4, 5, and 6. It was the mid-1970s, and he was in negotiations with the studio that was then called 20th Century Fox. And apparently negotiations were not going well. Lucas was about to walk away, quite frankly. And so in desperation, he said, couldn't you at least give me the merchandising rights? And at that time, movies weren't being merchandised. So the Fox executives, without thinking, said sure. Because to them, it sounded like, I want box office revenues on the moon or something like that. Well, the outcome of that is George Lucas continues to control all of the merchandising from the first 3 Star Wars films. International rights are also a big money maker for movies. I mean, this is why a movie will have internationally known stars in them, so that the movie will do well in our key markets overseas. Pay-per-view is a significant money maker for movies. Of course, premium cable, that's another type of right that can be sold. Sometimes, as the movie is being made, scenes for the video game are being shot alongside it. The economics of the video game business stack up quite favorably with the movie business. Those physical forms of media, they still matter. They still account for something, even if they're not as big as they once were. I think also in that category of they still matter, although they're not as big as they once were, would be basic cable rights or network television rights. Writing a book about the making of the film, or maybe a book version of the screenplay. There's some money in that. Merchandising, toys and clothes and other things you can buy that have something to do with the movie or its characters. That's a significant revenue source in many cases. And let us not forget product placement. The modern era of product placement probably started in the early 1980s with Steven Spielberg's E.T. If you've ever seen E.T., the little extraterrestrial is lured in by the little boy, Elliot, who lures in E.T. with Reese's Pieces. That was a famous product placement. Originally, the script called for E.T. to be lured in by M&Ms. Mars, the candy maker that makes M&Ms, they didn't see why they would have to pay for that few seconds on film. So the movie makers went off to Reese's, and the rest is movie and candy history. Movies or movie makers, at least some, have benefited from the long tail. Just imagine that you are the maker of a low-budget film, something that has a real specialty to it. It has a very targeted audience that is well down the long tail. Well, you can promote your film very inexpensively and make it available to that audience who, really might want to see it. Movies that would have, never gotten made 25 years ago now are being made. Furthermore, once you have that very specialized movie, something that is to a very segmented, very long tail type of audience, it used to be, where would you ever show this thing? If it's something that only 0.5% of the public is interested in, it would be hard to find a television channel that would want to show it. It would be hard to find a movie theater that would want to show it. But on Netflix and other streaming platforms, that 0.5% of the public, not only in the United States but overseas, they have a chance to see your film. I think for us as the viewers, this has been a good time. For us in the big cities, we're, kind of in a good position. All of these very obscure documentaries and art house films, they will show, somewhere around town, even if only briefly. If you live in the countryside, until recently, you never saw those obscure films. You never saw those documentaries. Well, now, because of the streaming services, they can see everything that we can see. And that concludes part 2 of the movie chapter.